Hello, and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast, Pollster Ratings Edition. I'm Galen Druk. So, periodically, 538 rates pollsters and the polls in general to see how accurate they are. The last time we did this was before the 2016 election. But the latest ratings are out this week, and so I'm here with Editor-in-Chief Nate Silver to get a lay of the polling land.
Is this an emergency podcast?
I don't think it's an emergency.
After a year and a half after the 2016 election, we finally update the pollster ratings.
It can be an emergency if we want it to be.
Okay.
It's a planned emergency. So like you said, it's been a year and a half. It's been a while since we've updated the pollster ratings. A lot has happened. The 2016 election as one example. What's the top line in these updates?
The top line is that what you hear from the media is wrong.
No, you're kidding. I had no idea that was going to be the top line.
No, the top line is that the media doesn't know what it's talking about when it describes polls. And in fact, if you look at polls over the long term, including in the 2016 general election, there's no trend toward polls becoming less accurate, or for that matter, more accurate.
Mm-hmm.
In our study, it covers American elections for all types of races since 1998, for presidential elections since 1972. So, for example, the average 2016 presidential poll in the final 3 weeks of the campaign was off by 4.8 percentage points. Not great. That means if you're up by 5 points, that could turn into a tie. However, the average error of all presidential polls since 1972 is 4.6 percentage points, so almost exactly the same. The whole idea that there's been a decline in polling reflects people who, number one, are pretty innumerate, meaning they don't seem to understand that when you have a poll that shows one candidate ahead by 3 points, the other candidate's going to win by 2 points lots of times.
Mm-hmm.
Number two reflects short memories. So in 1980, this was Reagan versus Carter, polls were off by almost 9 points on average, so twice as bad as we had in 2016, for example. Those polls literally showed a toss-up race, and Reagan wound up winning by 9.7, I think, percentage points in the popular vote.
Okay, so we're going to dig below that top line a little bit. But before we do that, can we just explain how we go about judging polls, how you rate them, and why you rate them?
So why we rate them is a good question. It's kind of a thankless exercise sometimes. But how we rate them is we look at every poll conducted in the last 21 days of campaigns for president, governor, and Congress. And for president, we also look at primary polls. We don't look at gubernatorial primary polls because those are A, hard to track down, and B, just crazy inaccurate. But that's what people are mostly looking at, right? They want polls of governor races, congressional races, and presidential races, and that's what we look at. We measure error by comparing how close the margin in the poll was to the actual margin, which means, for example, if you had a poll showing Hillary Clinton ahead by 1 point in Florida, and then Donald Trump wins Florida by 1 point, that's a pretty good poll. It's only 2 points off. We compare the margins. Let's say hypothetically that Hillary Clinton had won Florida by 10 points. We can say, hey, look, our poll pointed in the right direction. We don't look at calling the race right. That's not a pollster's job. The pollster's job is to reflect public opinion as accurately as they can, right? We'd say, actually, that was way off. You were off by 9 points. You just got lucky to get the right winner, right? And so that's the key thing here is that, when a poll shows a candidate, as it did Clinton in a lot of these states, with a lead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points or something like that, it doesn't take that much for the other candidate to win. In all these states that Trump won, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, he won them by a point. If Trump had won by 10 points, then it'd be a whole different conversation. Then it'd be like, oh, we've had the worst polling error since at least 1980. Things were way, way off, right? We wrote a piece, or Harry Enton, friend of the podcast and former 538, wrote a piece saying Trump is only a normal-sized polling error away from winning the election, which means that if the polls were off by as much as they usually are in the right states, then that would be enough for Trump to win. That's why his chances were 30%, which is pretty darn good. It didn't take that much for him to win the Electoral College. And the polls were obviously, I guess, correct about Clinton winning. Not I guess. They were correct about Clinton winning the popular vote.
And so why do we rank polls and pollsters?
For a couple reasons. Number one is that we don't want to be in a position where we have to make arbitrary distinctions between, yes, let's include this poll, yes, let's not include that poll. On the other hand, some polls are clearly more accurate over the long term than others. In our forecasts and our averages, we weight polls. And so the pollster ratings are what affects the fact that we will toot our own horn. The ABC News Washington Post poll, now affiliated with 538 as 538 becomes part of ABC News, but that poll has a great track record.
And so that counts more when we're looking at the model.
That counts more than say, a Zogby
here it
poll.
goes.
But I don't really want to like bash pollsters that much. It's like, almost everyone's doing honest. Well, there's some pollsters that are banned because we think they're fake, like literally are faking data.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to bash pollsters for like trying to get information out there. There are a few pollsters that I think are more interested in perpetuating a partisan narrative. I'm not big fans of Rasmussen reports and public policy polling. I'm not.
Although they don't score, I think I was looking this morning, PPP it's like a B.
Well, that's because
like
they kind of cheat.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
so you can't discern that from looking necessarily at the pollster
It's hard. So we did a study that was focused around PPP in 2014, which determined that like there was too little variance in their polling in a way that was like statistically improbable or even impossible, one might say. So the only way you get that is if you heard by saying, okay, I'm going to like make sure that my number is within a point of the Real Clear Politics or 538 average. So therefore, I will get a better pollster grade. And so I do worry. Whenever we do this, I want to call out public policy polling, and they can write me a nasty email. I don't really care, right? As someone that like manipulates their polls in a way that makes them superficially accurate but contributes no knowledge of the electoral environment because their polling solely reflects what everyone else says, and they're terrified of like ever going out on a limb. A lot of pollsters we hear from, they're concerned about these ratings, but I do think that like manipulating your results to put your thumb on the scale and be closer to the average is not good practice.
Okay, so we do this to both, it's useful for ourselves in the actual model, and also clarifies where pollsters stand in their practices and things like that to the public.
Well, and, so let's pick on Rasmussen reports. So we picked on PPP before, right? So Rasmussen reports brags about how it was the most accurate pollster in 2016 based on the fact that they had Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote by 2 points and she won by 2.1 points. That poll was spot on. However, Rasmussen reports it also has a spin-off called Pulse Opinion Research, which is how it brands some of the polls that it does. They did like 35 different polls, most of them at the state level in 2016 and beyond, so counting 27. We also include, by the way, 2017 gubernatorial elections, special elections, and so forth. And they've been about average, a little below average, in fact, if you look at this much larger sample size of polls. So partly it's to kind of correct media narratives where they get very focused around one or two races, right? Often the popular vote. It's funny, like with pollster experts, people are like, the popular vote for the U.S. presidency. Well, the popular vote arguably is the least important thing, right? But yeah, so it's partly to say, look, to really understand how accurate a poll is, you need to look at its performance over many election cycles. But before that, it's like, we only have a few data points for how well the poll did. You more want to look at methodology. And so our ratings are not purely based on empirical performance. It's a combination of accuracy historically and methodology.
To get back into the overall results of the polling landscape over the past year and a half, we already talked about the top line. On average, not particularly different, for better or for worse. If you look a little bit below that top line, and you do in the article that you wrote about this, which you called "The Polls Are All Right."
All right doesn't mean great. I'm all right.
But
if you say, "Hey, Galen, how you doing?"
ALL space right?
If you say, "Galen, how you doing?" I go, "I'm all right."
Yeah, and that like the polling environment was like, Nate, I'm all right.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, but if you look below that top line, right, there are some areas where polling is doing below average, and maybe there are lessons there, maybe there aren't. But for example, the primary polls in 2016.
Yeah,
what happened there, and how can we use?
I'm
going to
push back on that framing because to me, it's a miracle that polling even comes close to the mark
in primaries,
in anything.
In anything, period.
I mean, the fact is, like, we're just randomly calling people on the phone, only like 9% of whom actually answer the call, asking very sensitive questions about their political views, and yet people get really mad if the polls are off by like 3 points. Like, it's crazy to me that they're even close to the mark.
Wait, but the presidential primaries in 2016 were historically off.
Yeah, polls were pretty bad, although it was mostly on the Democratic side. I think people assume that, like...
Shy Trump voters.
So you want to know what actually happened in 2016?
Yes, tell me what actually happened in 2016.
Well, first of all, on the Republican side, polls overestimated Trump. People forget that because they don't actually look at evidence.
In the primary, right?
In the primary. Trump's margins against Ted Cruz were overestimated. Trump was supposed to win Iowa, according to the polls, and Cruz won. I think Oklahoma he was supposed to win, and then Cruz won. Later, it reversed itself a little bit, but overall polls actually overestimated Trump a little bit in the GOP primary. In the Democratic side, I don't know. I think you have an issue where, on the one hand, you had high youth participation, mostly voting for Bernie Sanders. On the other hand, you had high African American and Hispanic participation, mostly voting for Hillary Clinton. So you had big errors in both directions. In states with a big African American or Hispanic turnout, say South Carolina with African American, polls underestimated Clinton by quite a bit. In states with a big younger vote and a kind of whiter, more working class vote, they underestimated Bernie by quite a lot. Mm-hmm. Michigan, biggest polling miss, I think, in our database, not for an individual poll, but for like a race overall, is like Michigan, where Clinton was literally ahead by like 20 or 25 points in the polls and lost to Bernie Sanders. And so, I think part of this is that like it is problematic that response rates to polls decline and that you get a self-selected sample. Pollsters for general elections can use as a crutch the fact that demographic lines are so sharp in the general election, where if I know, like, okay, here's like a 32-year-old Asian American female living in Los Angeles, then I can predict without even asking her how she's going to vote, and I'll be right about that prediction a high percentage of the time, right? Much more difficult to know who's she's voting for in a what will probably be a 7 or 10 person or 15 person Democratic primary field in California in a couple of years.
So something to keep in mind this year as we watch the primaries for the midterm and, of course, 2020. Before we move on, I don't want to rile you up too much, but if we, again, dig below that top line and look at state-level polls, they were off more than the historical average by almost half a point. What's your assessment of what happened there?
Again, I'm not a pollster. Mm-hmm. My assessment of what happened is that you had a couple of things going on. Number one, you clearly did have some groups that were underrepresented in polls. So polls have a bias toward, on the one hand, highly educated voters. It's hard to get kind of non-college voters to answer polls. On the other hand, it's hard actually sometimes to get Black and Hispanic voters to answer polls. So what people may not realize is that you actually had biases that ran in two different directions in the polls of the 2016 general election, where Trump outperformed his polls in the Midwest and in red states, but Clinton actually beat her polls by a fair margin in states like California and Washington and Oregon, some of the East Coast states too, Massachusetts. Doesn't help you a damn lick,
right,
to like win California by 30 instead of 24 or 25. But that explains like why national polls were more accurate. That in national polls, you estimate low on some Clinton groups and low on some Trump groups, and it kind of almost cancels out. In state polls, it doesn't. In fact, you just have errors in different directions depending on the state.
In the piece, you relate this in part to the education divide that played out in 2016. I mean, if there is an actual realignment in the parties, does it make pollsters' jobs harder?
Sure, but I mean, in some sense it shouldn't, right? In some sense you're just kind of evaluating public. I mean, look, I do think pollsters lean pretty heavily on demographic weighting, right? Mm-hmm. In 2016, somewhat newly, education became maybe the most important after race demographic split. So if you're a pollster that's weighting by age and gender and race, and all of a sudden none of those are as important, or again, race is important, but age and gender are probably less important than education levels. Mm-hmm. And you tend to have polls that tend to get more highly educated consumers, then you're going to have problems potentially. And so I do hope pollsters correct that. I also hope pollsters realize that like you probably are having trouble getting representative samples of Hispanic voters in some Democratic states, kind of fairly consistently Democrats in the West. Some years it's California, some years it's Washington, some years it's Arizona, some years in Nevada. In the West, where you have these growing Hispanic populations, polls have tended to underestimate Democrats. And so I hope pollsters recognize that there are errors going in both directions. Because, we have had examples in the U.S. and other countries where pollsters overcompensate for the previous election and you wind up having a bias in a different direction. So far in special elections, gubernatorial elections so far this year, polls have underestimated Democratic candidates on average. People forget that in that Virginia gubernatorial race, polls were quite a bit low, although there's a big spread in the polls, but for the most part pretty low on Ralph Northam, the Democrat. In Alabama, polls were a little bit low on Doug Jones, the Democrat. And so if you actually kind of look at this, you see that like maybe pollsters now are terrified that they are missing Trump voters. Who knows? The other thing about 2016 is that there was a lot going on in the news cycle. So polling in the last 10 days of the campaign, which is after the Comey letter, was somewhat more accurate than polling 21 days out. Not great. So I don't think that's a fully great excuse, Mm-hmm. But again, it's like this article about pollster ratings is directed toward news consumers, toward people who read 538 or read news coverage of polling and other websites, right? Our job is just to describe how accurate polls are in the real world. I have no vested interest. I mean, I do because it like makes our lives easier if the polls are just right and every election's a blowout. But like, if the polls are getting worse, we will be the first people to tell you that, right? Because we will just expand the margins of uncertainty in our models based on the empirical data. And so what was a 70% chance might be a 60% chance or whatever else, right? That's what we are trying to do. We are not trying to say, we're probably also trying to say that like when the media tries to outguess the polls, then it usually goes badly, right? But like our job is to not conduct polls, but to say, here's how accurate polls are in the real world. And the polls are not nearly as accurate as people assumed before 2016. They're also not nearly as inaccurate as people assume now. In fact, very little has changed. If you go back and build models based on polling dating back for a couple of decades, then you should not have to update your model after 2016 because the data was about as accurate as you would expect it to be.
And how have the because it's included in this new data, how have the polls done since 2016? Has it been the same story roughly as they have been?
You could almost say a little bit better than average. So on average, they've been off by 5.1 points. And if you look at all polls dating back to 1998, it's 5.9 points. It's not a huge sample, we should say. But usually special elections are pretty tough to poll. And so the fact that you're having these pretty accurate results in special elections is encouraging. I mean, those should be hard races to get close to the right answer. And so, again, if you kind of just look and you can look at our charts and like, there's just not a long-term trend. You can plot a trend line over it if you want and look at it. And like, there are definitely like better or worse years, but there's just not a long-term trend. Maybe that's trend in the primary. Primary polls have kind of fairly consistently gotten worse. They were pretty bad in 2012 and then very bad in 2016. So if you want to make the argument, that's fine. But like people make like some of the worst examples, right? One of the examples that prove that you don't know what you're talking about is if you say that polls on Brexit were way off, then you are a moron. And we've said that on the program before, and I'm unforgiving of it because the polls on Brexit showed like a 1-point race, right? And then Remain lost by 4 points, right? If you don't understand that like that's your error of perception, not the polls error, then you should just not write about this field of endeavor, right? People don't understand how much they tend to cherry pick when they're looking at a complex series of data, and that when a candidate is a couple of points ahead in that polling average, that candidate will win the majority of the time, but a long way short of 100% of the time or 90% of the time. Probably a 3-point lead in a polling average translates to winning 2/3 of the time.
So getting back to the actual pollsters, there are challenges that pollsters are facing today. New challenges, not necessarily new since 2016 or 2012, but what are some of the challenges that they're facing as we look ahead to the midterms in 2020?
So challenge number 1A is that people respond to polls less often than they used to. And it's a long-run trend that's fairly dramatic over the long term. At least to telephone polls. Response rates to internet polls are higher. However, internet polling does not use what's called random probability sampling. So the idea of a probability sample is that any potential American or any citizen in the electorate is in theory equally likely to be contacted by the pollster and to participate in the poll. Is that true in practice? No. We know that people are more likely to participate in polls if they're white, if they're better educated, if they're female rather than male, actually. But pollsters can build in demographic adjustments for that. Online polls usually dispense with that notion, right? They say, we have a panel, and we know that the panel is a little bit self-selected, but we hopefully are picking the panel based on things that are unrelated to political behavior. If you just kind of recruit people and say, hey, be part of our panel to answer questions about X, right? And then, let's toss in a few political questions, right? And with clever kind of weighting schemes, we can overcome the fact that we're not using a classic probability sample. Actually, one of the bigger headlines from the pollster ratings this year is that like online pollsters did not do very well in 2016. It's a little bit of a case-by-case basis. If you're work for YouGov and listening to this, YouGov is a poll that did pretty well. But, SurveyMonkey did not do well. Google Consumer Surveys did not do well. And in general, online polls introduces about an additional point of error versus telephone polls, which is a pretty big deal. And so if the idea was that like, now kind of the online revolution in polling is here, I don't know. Telephone polls were quite a bit better in 2016.
Mm-hmm. I mean, is one of the challenges also polls being funded to a lesser degree than they have been in newsrooms and at universities?
Yeah, I mean, look, newsroom budgets in general are being cut, and polling is expensive and gets more expensive now. To do a good poll, then you have to call cell phones. You have to make 2 or 3 or 4 phone calls to a person to get a response when I might have taken one phone call before. So it's all more expensive and more difficult. There's also stuff like if you're only going to do a couple of polls, it's easier to like just do like a national poll or something. One message I would have to pollsters, plural, is divide and conquer a little bit. The pollsters I like are pollsters like Quinnipiac or Marist that will concentrate on 3 or 4 or 5 important states and get really good at polling those states. Or Monmouth does this a little bit, right? I don't care if we didn't see a single national poll I take that back. National polls do provide some information, but like we had way too many national polls in 2016 and not enough polling. I mean, what would have happened if a Quinnipiac or a Marist college had polled Wisconsin late in the race? There were barely any polls in the last week of the campaign in Wisconsin, and they were kind of not traditionally higher quality polls. Some of the lower quality polls actually showed the race tightening there a fair bit. What would have happened if you had Monmouth or Marist or Quinnipiac polling there? Maybe they would have showed a 2-point race or something. I don't know. But like enough darn national polls. Let's poll enough generic ballot polls. We love a generic ballot, but like go poll, especially if you're an online pollster and they're like, oh, we have the 53 different online tracking polls. Go pick 6 to 8 states or congressional districts. They're either important or that other people aren't polling. And if you want to prove that online polling or your new poll, your new telephone poll is as good as the more reliable traditional ones, then go nail the results in a series of states in the 2018 midterms. And then that would bolster confidence a lot.
Wrapping this up, looking ahead to the 2018 midterms, maybe even 2020 if we want to get into that, but we don't have to. What should people keep in mind about the polls that they're watching, particularly in the primaries as we move forward in primary season? And then, House races in particular, I think there's a lot of uncertainty there, right?
Yeah, look, I know people are going to listen to this and be like, oh, but, and the headline, the polls are all right, is a little bit trollish, right?
You don't say.
Because we are trying to push back against what we think is a pretty false narrative, and so we're kind of pushing into that a lot. But the lessons do really cut both ways, and part of the lesson is be prepared for uncertainty. Polls are most accurate in presidential general elections, followed by Senate and gubernatorial elections. Okay, so what's on the docket right now? First of all, we have a midterm where, in my view, the most interesting race is for the House. Polling in the House is a rough enterprise. You're going to have maybe, first of all, lots of races won't get polled at all. Some polls you'll only have partisan polls that are put up by Democratic or Republican candidates. And then even with races where you are lucky enough to have a nonpartisan poll or two, those polls are off by about 6 points on average. And so do not trust anyone who now or at any point in the future claims they can predict the number of Democratic House gains within a few seats, right? They are bullshitting you. And they're the same types of people that gave Clinton like a 99% chance or whatever in 2016. The House is a rough thing to forecast. We can maybe get within 10 or 20, maybe, but not do a lot better than that. Then we're going to encounter the presidential primaries, which is probably even rougher. Also, polls tend to be further from the mark in multi-candidate races because you have more opportunity for things to go on at the last minute, for strategic and tactical voting to occur, for candidates to drop out or whatever else. And so polling in the 2020 Democratic primaries is going to be quite an adventure, right? But this has always been true. Polling is always pretty wild in the primaries. It's 2008, the polls were great. Well, no, they were off by 7.5 points in 2018 and in 2008 Democratic primaries. Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire. Remember that when she was down by 7 points at polls? We used to think that was terrible. Oh my gosh, 7 points. Well, 7 points is a pretty big miss. But then you had Michigan in 2016 where she was ahead by 22 in Michigan and lost. But the point is be prepared for what polling can tell you and what it can't tell you. And by the way, don't assume that if the polls are off, it's going to be in the way that you'd like. You know what I mean? Maybe you're a Republican and you're saying, okay, polls show us as underdogs to keep the House, but it's close, which is probably an accurate summation of the evidence right now, right? You're right. Republicans could very easily win the House. Democrats could also win 58 seats or something, right? It kind of cuts both ways a lot, and both people who read polls and news media who covers polls, they kind of assume that because polls are off, that's going to mean that that my hypothesis or my prior is right. If anything, it's usually the opposite.
It seems like the theme here is, and one of the themes of this podcast in general, is that there's a lot of uncertainty. And so given that uncertainty, do you think that people focus too much on polls in general?
Well, I think I'd rather focus on polls and like the media narrative about the race. And the whole idea of why do news organizations conduct polling is that you want to like prevent the media, because the media is like a little bit of a rat pack, and there's a pack mentality and a herd mentality, and like so you want to like actually check in and test your beliefs against members of the general public, right? That's like the noble impulse behind polling. So I'd rather have polling driven horse race commentary than other types of horse race commentary. If people want to say, hey, let's talk about, death tolls in Puerto Rico, or let's talk about, immigration policy, then that's fine. But like RVO 538 is like, there is a better way and a worse way to do horse race commentary. A giant bulk of the news cycle election years is about horse race commentary, and a lot of it's really bad. And a lot of it is bad because people want to provide false certainty, or in some cases false uncertainty. It does cut both ways a little bit, but like in general, to look at polls, you have to get comfortable with margins of uncertainty. And you also have to know something about like when are polls more accurate or less accurate. If Clinton had been ahead as she was pre-Comey letter, 6 points in the polling average instead of 3 points, that's not perfectly safe. But it's on the verge of, if she had blown a 6-point lead, then that's different, right? But if she's up 1 or 2 points in a general election, that's not safe at all. In a primary, or in a House race, or maybe a special election, right? In one of those races, you can be up 9 points, and you're going to lose sometimes because just polls are not that precise necessarily. And so understanding like when polls are relatively more and less accurate. But again, it's shifted. It used to be that like we would, for the media to make any characterization of the race at all would be really hard. And, people always wanted to say, oh, it's a toss-up. They were afraid to say anything. And now it's kind of shifted where, like, it's like kind of this sophomoric phase where people kind of think they understand how to interpret polling. And I think it's easy to do. And, like, I have to be honest, like, the evidence is that it's hard to do, actually. The very broad consensus of almost all news outlets that you read in 2016 was that Hillary Clinton had it in the bag. That is not what the polls said if you know how accurate polls are historically and if you looked at the Electoral College, which is how elections are decided. And then for like just kind of casting blame on the polls after that's why this podcast is so prickly. You can fast forward now and go to the next, more friendly podcast, right? But I get angry when someone is in error and they double down on that error even after the fact, right? We make lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of mistakes at 538, but it's important to like look back and reflect with hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, kind of what actually happened. And when you kind of actually look back and go back and look at how accurate were the polls actually in 2016,
they were all right.
They were all right.
They were all right.
Polls had never been great, but they were all right. They were okay.
All right. Well, I think that's the end then.
Okay.
All right, Nate. Thanks for taking the time to talk through this. Listeners can find the pollster ratings on the website, 538.com, along with more analysis there by Nate and a bunch of helpful charts for putting 2016 in context. Also, a shout out to Drew Melmeta. He's a database journalist here who curated and compiled a ton of these polls.
Yeah, it's really a group effort here at 538. There are more than 8,000 polls in this database. So thank you, Drew Mill and Andrea and Andre and Aaron and everyone on the team for collecting this data. And we should also say this data is available, this polling database, every poll since 1998, last year's election, that's in a database that you can download for free at GitHub. It should be GitHub/538/pollster-ratings-data. Maybe that's our internal version.
Maybe we can tweet it out or something. Yeah. We'll figure it out.
We'll tweet it out.
All right, that's a wrap. I'm Galen Druk. We'll be back on Monday, but until then, thanks for listening.